Good morning, everyone. I'm Pratha Bhatt, the Events Executive at GIA, and I welcome you to our event on carbon credits. Today, we are honored to host a panel discussion on the topic of paramount importance, carbon credits. As we confront the urgent need to address climate change, understanding the complexities and potentials of carbon credits is crucial in our collective journey towards a sustainable future. Our esteemed panelists bring a wealth of expertise and knowledge on the table. First, we have Miklos Vestrimi, a climate and sustainability consultant at BCG Dubai. His unique background in both sustainability consulting and arts as a former internationally touring concert pianist lends a dynamic perspective to the conversation. Next, we're privileged to have Jean-Pierre Raymond, a Swiss career diplomat with extensive experience in climate action and international humanitarian law. We also have with us Professor Nathan Sussman. He is a professor of international economics and the director of Center for Finance and Development at the Institute. With his profound knowledge of monetary and finance economic history, Professor Sussman enriches our discussion with his scholarly insights. The discussion will be guided by my esteemed colleague, Jai. So without further ado, go ahead, Jai.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, our esteemed speakers for coming here for our participation. So before kicking off the whole session, I would like to briefly introduce the agenda of this event. So first of all, we are going to have a speech led by our speaker, Miklos Vestrimi, and then after that, we are going to have a question-led debate among our speakers. Finally, we will wrap up the whole event by a Q&A session from our audiences. So, Miklos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I would just like to give you an introduction to carbon credits, what they are, what the market is like these days, and then just talk about where this market could be going in the future to open for the debate with my two esteemed colleagues. So there are 4 questions that I'd like to talk about today. So first of all, what are carbon credits? Secondly, what is their role in fighting climate change? Thirdly, what is preventing carbon credits from scaling? And fourthly, some thoughts on the future of the market. So to start with, first, what are carbon credits? I'd just like to take a step back and just reflect on how we got here. So we've been ignoring climate science for centuries, literally, at this point. The first time that the greenhouse effect of carbon dioxide was described was in 1856 at my alma mater, Yale, actually. And since then, there have been a series of events over the years and decades that have been showing the world that climate change is very real and very urgent. My favorite date on this slide is 1979, the first World Climate Change Conference in Nijmegen, Netherlands. And we've all heard of the Kyoto Protocol that was great in being first legally binding protocol, but it only applies to the developing nations. Whereas the Paris Agreement in 2015 was not legally binding, but it applied to all nations. Now, in 1979, we had the opportunity to have both, because that is before everybody was completely aware of the consequences of climate change. But if we compare that, for example, with the Montreal Protocol on ozone emissions, that would have been a real opportunity to lock in an international agreement at a time in which world emissions were about half of what they are right now. But we missed that opportunity, and we're still fighting to this day. So last year, we already surpassed the 1.5 degrees, the aspirational target of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we're obviously in desperate need for some solutions. And I believe that carbon credits could be one of those. So off to carbon credits. So I like to characterize the carbon credit space along 2 dimensions. So you have tech-based versus nature-based, and then you have avoidance versus removal. And in this matrix, you have then 4 different combinations that are represented by some of these solutions that I presented, these are just examples. They're not exclusive. But for example, for avoidance credits, so that is avoiding carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere by undertaking certain actions that will prevent expected emissions. So an example would be clean cook stoves. If you compare cutting down trees from a forest with having gas stoves, obviously the gas stoves are going to be a bit better for the environment. Then if we go to avoidance nature-based, that is saying, okay, well, it's likely that a forest is going to be deforested, cut down, burnt down, whatever. And if we have an intervention that lowers that likeliness, then we've effectively avoided some of those emissions. Then on the nature-based removal side, we have planting a new forest that sequesters more carbon than if there was no forest there. And then finally, on the tech-based removal, we have direct air capture, most famously promulgated by Climeworks, a Zurich-based startup, but there are a few other companies that are starting to do that. And that is a process of literally sucking out carbon dioxide out of the air and then bottling it or putting it underground. They don't actually bottle it, but and now I'd just like to talk about what the different parameters are around this. So let's start with whether they work. So I've colored these in ways to try to illustrate whether they do work or not. So clean cook stoves, do they work? Do they actually sequester carbon? Yes, they do, but sometimes it's a bit questionable because it's difficult to measure. How likely is it that that carbon actually was going to go into the air? And how likely is it that that carbon was actually sequestered to those cook stoves? How likely is it that those cook stoves were even going to be bought or bought in any case? Then with avoidance, there we'll get to some of these issues later with some scandals that have happened. Oftentimes it is questionable whether it happens or not. Then direct air capture, I would argue, if you have that carbon dioxide in a bottle or in the ground, nobody's going to deny that you actually captured it. And then planting a new forest, again, like if the forest is there and before it wasn't, probably you achieved something. Now, how long do they bury the CO2? Now, this is a very important aspect because if you just bury the CO2 for 10 years and then it's back out, it's great for 10 years, but after that it doesn't matter so much. And again, we see direct air capture basically buries it forever because it transforms the CO2 into rock. So unless someone goes and digs up that rock and melts that rock, it's not going anywhere. Preventing deforestation, again, there have been some scandals that have questioned that. Where are they located? Also important aspect to bring a little bit of light to the geopolitical aspect of this all. So we have direct air capture in Iceland. The company is based in Zurich. It's also quite expensive, that'll be the next slide. But it's mostly developed world, whereas the tech-based and nature-based avoidance is more in the developing world. So certain incentives emerge from this reality. Then finding how expensive are they, and this really sheds a very different light. So preventing deforestation, you must have seen when you fly somewhere with Ryanair or something, you pay, I don't know, $100 for a flight, and then you can add, $1.66 to have all of your emissions offset. Well, it's unlikely that you're actually doing anything but satisfying your conscience. So yeah, I mean the price for avoidance-based, nature-based avoidance credits is somewhere in like $1 to $10 per ton, whereas direct air capture can be up to 1,000. So a factor 100 or even 1,000 difference. And just for context, so a flight from here to New York or London to New York is about 1 ton of CO2 flying economy class, just for context. The average Swiss citizen emits about 5 tons of CO2 per year. So if you think 5 tons of CO2 per year, if that was your personal emissions, you could offset it for probably 10 francs. Or you could offset it for 5,000 francs. So there's a big difference on what effect that has. Then additional benefits, also an important aspect. If you just have some direct air capture, you're just capturing that CO2 and putting it in the ground in the same place, nobody really profits from it. So you don't have a forest that has all these ecosystem benefits. You don't create jobs for local people, apart from the people in the company. Whereas, yeah, preventing deforestation is great because you are keeping forests that are there alive. And the best forest is the forest that's already there. So, yeah, that's that for carbon credits. I'd like to move on to another question, which is the role of fighting climate change. Let me just sort out some of my pages. Yeah, so with this topic, I'd just like to address three controversies around carbon credits and just shed some light that I'm sure we'll discuss in greater depth. So first of all, that carbon credits are a moral hazard. Secondly, that they juggle emissions around, but it's basically just an accounting trick. And thirdly, that their effect is net negative. So to focus just on the first question, yeah, I'll just don't have slides for all of this, but since about 2015, the IPCC reports that have been reporting on what we need to be doing to really fight climate change have started including negative emissions or carbon removal. And this was started at a time in which the technological readiness of carbon removal was very, very far from actually being a market technology. So there has been this idea that carbon removal is going to blossom and actually become a scalable technology. But to give a perspective on that, so Climeworks, one of the largest carbon removal companies right now, has a plant in Iceland, and it removes about 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. So that's the equivalent of the annual emissions of 500 homes. So in other words, completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. They have sold their future carbon credits for several years already for all these companies that are desperate for these high quality credits. But it's clear that they will have to scale so many orders of magnitude to actually make a difference. But I would just like to point out that solar energy, which today in many places is the cheapest form of energy, in fact was extremely expensive at another point as well. The only use for solar energy in the 1960s was for spaceflight. They would use solar energy to power the rovers on the moon, because that was the only thing that had enough money to pay for solar panels. Everything else was just completely impossible. And I mean, we keep being surprised by the decrease in price of some of these technologies. So there is hope that that might happen as well. Yeah, I mean, there's also, so back to the moral hazard question. So they're one of the largest carbon removal and storage plants was the Century plant from an oil major, Occidental. And this plant almost made no impact. So they were saying that they were sequestering all this carbon, and then finally when the numbers were run, it turned out that nothing actually happened. So when you have these carbon credits, the argument goes, well, it encourages companies to keep polluting because they think that they can just sequester all of that. And then if those sequestered credits don't actually make a difference, it's like you actually polluted more because you thought that you had this on the side. So very much a real issue. Happy to discuss that at greater length with my colleagues later. Moving on to the second point, that they juggle emissions but change nothing. Now, to me, this point ignores a fundamental principle of economics in that there's the time value of money. So if you think you're a company and you have a choice of 10 different actions you can take to lower your emissions, and some of them are more expensive than others, it makes sense to go for the cheapest ones and then go for some more expensive ones later down the line. Why? Because it's better to be sequestering carbon now than in 10 years. And if having these carbon credits allows them to start taking more action now instead of more action later, even though the complete action that they've taken is the same in the two time frames, it makes more sense to do more earlier because you have less carbon in the atmosphere for longer. So that is one of these functions of carbon credits that, yes, it's just an accounting trick, but an accounting trick actually does make a real world difference. And then finally, on the last point that they do net harm, there definitely are great arguments for that. So there was this explosive report that was published by The Guardian last year that showed that 90% of rainforest carbon credits by the biggest certifier, Vera, were not actually achieving anything. And now, how does that work? Well, let's just go back to the nature-based avoidance credits. So if you think of what this means conceptually, it says you have a forest, and you try to assume how likely it is that that forest is going to be burned down. Now, how do you actually calculate that? It's to some extent just an estimation that you take out of the air, because you don't know how likely it is that that forest is going to burn down or be cut down or something. So that's the first number. Then how likely is it that that forest is actually, that the intervention that you make is actually going to lower that likelihood? Again, a number that has a lot of estimation. And as a result of having multiple steps that have to be estimated, the largest certifier ended up with a situation that most of what it was doing, when some accountants really looked into it, seems to be worthless. Now, this is very controversial. There are a lot of people that said that this is an unfair characterization. I'm just saying this is what happened. And it definitely needs to be taken seriously because it colors the entire market. I just wanted to say to finish this chapter is that carbon credits, nevertheless, are something that the market knows how to work with. It is an economic tool that the current economy understands and can count for in balance sheets. So let's just take that into account as we move to some further points. So now let's talk about what is preventing carbon credits from scaling. I already shed some light on the points that I made, but I'd like to make four different arguments. So first of all, around market skepticism, then secondly, around the heterogeneity of the credits and the problems that causes, then talk about the market infrastructure and how that is missing in many cases, and finally, the double counting challenge. So just to start with the market skepticism argument. So we just heard of this Vera project that spectacularly failed to be sequestering the carbon, they said. Now, when you buy a carbon credit, this is basically a piece of paper that says that you have sequestered this much carbon in this place for this long. But all the registries right now, they have a limit of 40 years. And now that's a problem because what happens after those 40 years? There's no more incentive for any party to actually be taking care of those credits. So in 40 years, if everybody's buying all these credits, potentially we might have a big problem. And that is kind of a systemic issue that hasn't really been resolved, because to just say, well, we're going to be paying for the maintenance of those credits, for the maintenance of that forest, that new forest that was planted forever, is kind of a dangerous proposition. Like, whenever finance people hear forever, it's like we can't really deal with that because you don't know what's going to happen in the infinite future. So as a result, we have this situation in which some companies have bought credits and they bought credits, but it's not necessarily made the effect that they wanted. And an example is actually my former employer, EY, that bought a whole bunch of credits from South Pole. This is one of the local companies that trades a lot of these credits. But then it turned out in one of these fiascos, these recent fiascos, with the large project in Africa, that the South Pole could no longer guarantee that these credits are actually going to stay in the ground as long as they were promised. So all these credits kind of went up in air, and then EY also, as a result of some changing regulations around the way that they can be accounted for net zero targets, had to walk back on what they had promised. So they had said that by 2021, they would be net zero, and then by 2025, they would be net negative. Now, this is a huge company with 400,000 employees that are flying around all the time. I mean, I was one of them. And to say that you're going to be net negative, you can only do that if you buy carbon credits. But that is assuming that the carbon credits are actually doing what they say. So a bit of a bad moment for this and many other companies that were putting a lot of hope on this. Then secondly, the heterogeneity of credits. So the reason why financial markets work so well is because stocks can be compared. You have all these aspects of a stock, how the management works, how much debt the company has taken on, what their ESG scores are, and all of that is put into a single number, which is the stock price. And that stock price can be compared to any other stock price. Now, carbon credits do have a price, but that price has a lot of little footnotes as well around the additional benefits they have, around the ecosystem services, around preserving natural environments. And all these aspects make it more difficult to just compare one to the other. Because if you have like one carbon credit that is nature-based and has a forest in Kigali and has these 20 benefits, and then you have this other one that has these 15 other benefits in Vietnam, how do you compare them if you just have one price plus all this other stuff? And that is one of the aspects that's preventing it from scaling, the lack of fungibility in economic terms. Next point I'd like to talk about is the market infrastructure. So developed markets in general have 6 types of market intermediaries to become efficient. You have clearinghouses, you have advisors, you have traders, auditors, raters, and insurance. And these are all aspects that are necessary to make Western markets as efficient as they are. And carbon credits has had 5 of these so far. So for example, clearinghouses. Clearinghouses is Vera, this name that you've heard a few times. This is the issuer of all these carbon credits. And what they do is enable the transactions. They maintain a carbon registry and standardize the projects as much as possible. Now, you have advisors. Advisors are, for example, my company, BCG or South Pole or many others, that give information to potential buyers what they should buy. Then third, you have trading platforms. Trading platforms are, for example, Air Carbon Exchange. These are where you can compare different carbon credits and decide what you want to buy. Then auditors. Auditors are, for example, also EY does auditing, but a lot of other companies as well. And these audit carbon offset projects to give trust that what these buyers are actually purchasing are legit carbon credits. Then finally, raters. Raters, they basically tell you how good is a carbon credit that has all these other aspects. How trustworthy is it? And then finally, what we've been missing until very recently is the 6th point, which is insurance providers. So when something is not quite clear how risky it is, how likely it is to reverse, how likely it is to have damage, you have insurance. And insurance packages all those numbers into a single variable, which is an insurance premium. And in the last few months, we've had several startups come up, Carbon Pool and Kita being 2 examples, that have started providing very innovative insurance models. So this is one of these pieces of market infrastructure that is starting to really mature and develop very quickly. Yeah, I mean, here's a illustration of the price of carbon credits. this is where you would see that you want an insurance provider, because if you buy a carbon credit, say in 2019 or something, and it goes for $20, and then all of a sudden in 2023 it's at $100, your carbon credit burns up because the forest burns up, whatever. If you've made corporate commitments that you've reduced your emissions by so much thanks to these carbon credits, and then you have to buy back that carbon credit for 5 times as much as you bought it, you want insurance to cover that. And that is why this is a very, very important aspect. Let's move on to my last point, which is some aspects on the future of carbon credits. So I'd like to talk about 4 aspects here. So first, demise of the market through what could be called neocolonialism. Secondly, a demise of the market because of difficulties in the voluntary market. Then thirdly, a continued erratic height of the market. And then fourthly, a possible bifurcation. These are just aspects of where the market could go in the future. So to start with the first aspect, the demise through neocolonialism. So on this aspect, if we think of the way that carbon credits work, for a developing country, say some country that has a lot of forest credits, has some tropical jungles, it's very cheap for them to be selling carbon offsets right now, because they have the jungle, it's producing these carbon offsets, and some rich country, for example, Switzerland, can buy them up. So it buys up the right to have the carbon credits from that forest. Now, what does this mean? For Switzerland, this is a great deal. They're doing it right now, in fact, because for very, very cheap, they get these rights to these forest credits. Now, what is going to happen in the future when that country needs to start reducing their own emissions? Well, they've already sold the very cheapest credits to Switzerland. So this means that they are going to have to start buying more expensive credits from somewhere else, for example, Switzerland. And we remember that the forest credits are going for maybe $10, maybe $100, and the Swiss credits from Climeworks are going upwards of $1,000 sometimes. So as soon as we have countries starting to realize and take seriously that this could happen, we potentially could face a very difficult situation in which countries with lots of forest credits have no incentive to sell these credits unless they sell them for the highest price of the most expensive, highest quality credits, because they're going to have to buy them back in the future if they want to honor their own climate commitments at any point in the future. So when that happens, that's going to mean that the entire market just goes to what the most expensive is, which is fine, but it will definitely slow down the market. And we already have many countries that are starting to take that into account. For example, Tanzania has a revenue split of all money that is going toward these. Kenya is retaining 25% of all carbon revenues. Similarly, Zimbabwe, Honduras has completely closed forest-based carbon credits. So you have a number of countries that are starting to take some restrictions because of this difficulty. Then, secondly, the demise by the voluntary market. So we saw just what happened with EY. I was talking about how they promised to be carbon negative by next year, and then they had to walk back, which is very, very embarrassing. Now, a major standard that all of these companies are using to make their net zero commitments is the so-called Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this is this corporate standard that dictates how much companies need to reduce their emissions and how to be able to call themselves a Science-Based Targets Initiative net zero strategy. And recently, they said that with removals, you cannot use carbon removals to claim your net zero strategy. And just last week, they actually changed that opinion to have that reinstated. So now, again, you can claim removals until very specific conditions. And going back and forth in this, could lead to some problems just because companies don't know how to plan for or against this. Then another possibility is a continued erratic hype. And here's just one illustration of some ideas of where this might go. So here I have a whole bunch of different companies that have estimated the size of the 2030 carbon credits market worldwide. And the first three are from 2021. The rest are from afterward. And that is interesting, that the ones from 2021 are so much higher. And we're looking at enormous numbers. So like Bloomberg, 2021 was predicting the market would be $500 billion in 6 years from now. Right now it's $2 billion. So how is that possible? Well, if we go back to the price curve here, something was happening in 2021. You see that? It started going up pretty quickly. And why did the price go up so much? Well, it was the crypto boom. You had all these crypto companies that were selling crypto coins and were saying that everything that you're doing is all carbon neutral. Why? Because they were buying up all these credits, which were these cheap credits, but there was this huge demand for credits that wasn't really real. Because it was fake credits for companies that didn't really care about this. It was just to increase their sales, really. And that is when companies like, well, some of the reports that came out at the time is like, oh boy, this market is just booming. So if we just continue that movement, in a few years from now, it's going to be enormous. And then since then, the market hasn't really increased. So it's really unclear. And then the companies that had their estimations afterward, these are just some select reports, had much lower numbers. Still enormous. I mean, BCG, the lowest one is like $40 billion by 2030. That is an enormous market. But the range of estimations, I've heard estimations that by 2030 it's going to be like trillions of dollars. So it's really any man's guess where this is going. And then just the last point, which is the bifurcation. Now, for me, this is a very interesting proposition. This was published in a report by Bloomberg. The idea that we might have two different markets. You have one market that is all about the benefits. You have the other market that is all about the sequestration. So you have the high quality credits that are being bought and sold just for their potential to sequester carbon. Those are Climeworks or high quality forest offsets. And then you have the other ones that de facto are development aid. And that is fine, that is very important, but shouldn't be confused with carbon sequestration. Because development aid, as important as it is not directly doing something about climate change. The two are connected, but not the same thing. So basically using all these credits with a lot of additional benefits and pricing them separately as a separate market. So that's kind of it for my introduction to carbon credits. And now I'm looking forward to a debate about them with my colleagues.
Thank you so much for your speech. Personally, I'm very interested in this topic, and I have quite a lot of questions for you and also our panelists. So the first question will be about the fake credits part, because I noticed that this is quite harsh word to me, and I found it, is it really appropriate to use this word here? So I'd like to know about the fake credits that companies that are not really interested in remove all those carbon emissions in the air. So is there an alternative in a market or in a real practice to remove carbon instead of carbon credit markets? And how do we address the trust deficiency problem, please?
So I think the Becker should answer that first, but about fake credits. But so let me maybe reframe the whole. I mean, give it a little bit of a different perspective on what we're saying in terms of So I think when you started out, there was a distinction between those things that in terms of climate change. So we look at two things, and I'm using something that I've heard from Philip Moss, who's one of the leaders now of the carbon removal with NextGen, when he came to talk to our class a couple of weeks ago here at the Institute. So basically he said the issue of carbon and the what's happening with the CO2 emissions and climate is, so he compared it to, as an analogy, to a bathtub. And so think about the water in the bathtub, the CO2. And so you have a tap where sort of the water is coming and filling the tap, the bathtub, and obviously the sort of the disaster is that the water starts to spill out and then goes down to the apartments below and wrecks your apartment and everything. So there are two things you can do. One of them is turn off the taps, and then but the bathtub still stays full. And the other thing is open the sinkhole and let the water go down. So these are the two kind of ways to deal with this problem. Now, obviously, you cannot do without, I mean, if you just open the sinkhole but keep the bathtubs running, the faucets running at full speed, you're not doing enough, and the other way around. So if you just turn off the bathtubs, you're still stuck with all this carbon that we've emitted all these years that actually is causing climate change. So we have to reverse. So that's kind of the way he framed it, and so the market has two types of. I mean, in order to address it, you need to have two actions. One is turning off the faucets, and the other one is incentivizing carbon removal to actually open the sinkholes and let it go. So that's kind of the way to look at these markets, and so what at least what we think as economists is that you can have very complex ways to turn off the faucets, but the easiest one is basically either you prohibit it, which is you just and we all remember what happened during COVID. So at some point somebody told us that's it, we shut it down. And what we saw also in terms of carbon emissions, there were all these nice satellite images of places that were really polluted suddenly became very clean. So that's why we could do this. It's a very strict regulation with a lot of cost, as we know from COVID. The other thing is to tax the activity, and research shows, and it's not something that is disputable, that actually once you increase the price of something, you tax it, and we call this the carbon tax. Then everybody internalizes this, and depending of course on your how elastic you are in terms of your response to switch between types of energy and what are the alternatives. But with the right price, you can actually turn off these faucets or make the flow very, very slow in terms of filling the bathtub. So these things are very effective, and in a carbon tax, the issue of fake credits and all these things is basically not an issue, because you're basically taxing the use of energy, which is really easy to monitor. I mean, monitoring the use of energy is something that is really easy to monitor. People fill up their gas stations, their cars in gas stations. Even criminals who avoid taxation and do all kinds of other stuff, they still go to the gas station, they still turn on the light and get their lights from the public utility. So all these things, so tax avoidance is really hard in this, it's not impossible, but it's really hard in terms of a carbon tax. So this is the mitigation part, and then you don't have to fake things. Then you go to the removal part, which I think is where you spend most of the time, because on these sequestration and the climate works, all these things sucking up from the air. So there, I mean, it's providing incentives for developing technologies, efficient technologies for carbon removal. And that's where we, as economists, we think that subsidies or some credits, as you call them, some positive incentives, instead of a tax, which is kind of, you have the sticks and the carrots. So the tax is a stick, and we know these sticks work. But if we want to encourage carbon removal, then it's not enough. Of course, the tax plays a role in some sense, because it gives a price to carbon, allows these companies of the carbon removal to price their technologies, but still you need incentives, and for that we need the credits in some sense, and we want to direct them to these things that actually are not fake. And again, it's really hard to measure how we, there are all these scams about removal. And so we want to encourage the technologies where we can measure this. And I agree, like with solar panels, it's just a matter of time. You give the incentives, there are many bright minds around. We'll figure out a way to measure properly the carbon removal and avoid these fake claims. I mean, with the right incentives, I think the technology is there. And just reminding people that if we face, again, during COVID, when they shut down the economies everywhere, huge incentive to create the vaccine, huge incentive. And again, different companies, you can say this AstraZeneca and Pfizer, maybe not the same quality, the Chinese, the Russians, Sputniks, or whatever. But in the end, you could see that in a very short period of time, we came up with great solutions all over the world because we had great scientists. So if the price is right and if the credits are high enough, then you generate the technology, and we have the bright minds, so hopefully some of them shift away from crypto to dealing with measuring carbon credits, because right now, great minds are sucked into crypto, which actually is something that's producing a lot of emissions. But once we have the right price, then the technologies will emerge, and I think that's why I agree that this is where the credits are really effective. And this is the market we have to kind of design for the carbon removal.
I see. Thank you very much. Jean-Pierre, I also have a question for you. So following the discussion of technology, I want to know that in the real practice in the government or institutions, what kind of incentives or policies do we design to promote the R&D in carbon removal technologies?
So thank you. So first of all, I think we should reframe completely the conversation. So many thanks to both of you. And thank you for presenting somehow carbon credits in an objective way. It's really important. Yeah, well done, well done. So, I mean, we are not working in vacuum. I mean, I appreciate very much the example of the bath tube and so on, but unfortunately, there is a reality. And this reality is called the carbon budget. And we have to deal with it because the ecosystem, our ecosystem where we live, depends on how much CO2 is emitted in the atmosphere. And it's not that you can emit as much as you like for the next centuries. We have a very short amount of time available. The carbon credit, according to the IPCC, if we don't want to exceed 1.5 degree, means that in 5 years and 3 months to be precise, it will be exhausted. So 5 years is not tomorrow, it's today. So it's nice to have all this conversation about carbon credits, is it effective, is it fake, and so on. But there is an emergency that is right now in front of us, and we have 5 years to solve the problem. So this is very important because when we emit, it's real emissions. And when we have carbon credit, somehow it's a dream because it's not effective in many cases. And second, as in most cases, you don't suck out the CO2, you just hope that you will not go in the next 40 years and so on. So reality, what is the reality? When carbon compensation has been created in the end of the 80s, the idea was pretty simple. As we emit, if on some place you remove it, it will compensate, what is basically right. The only small problem is that because of this carbon credit are not 100% secure, in the reality, it didn't remove almost anything, and we continue to increase CO2 emission. So at the end of the in the 90s, when at end of the 80s when it was invented, we were at 37 billion tons emitted per year. Okay. In 2000, 10 years later, we were at 41. Okay, so you see, it didn't increase that much. Maybe it started working. But when we started to sell really this carbon credit after the Kyoto Protocol until nowadays, now 20 years later more, we are at 54 billion tons emitted per year. Is it effective? I mean, I'm sorry to say, it doesn't work at all. It's just a dream. So it gives the examples that I always like to tell. It's in the Middle Ages, the church and many bright people invented a system of indulgences. It means that if you make a sin, you can pay something to the church or to a middleman, and because you make somehow a kind of donation, and the higher the donation, the better it will be, because the church is very powerful, they can somehow have a kind of discussion with God and make sure that it will be recognized when we go to hell or to paradise. And because you paid, somehow you will be absolved of the sins you have done. So it was great, and it worked. I mean, it was a big market, like the carbon credit market, billions. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, nothing worked because there was no proof whatsoever that you were absolved really. So it's exactly the same now. We invent a story with a lot of niceties around, and we hope it will work. But contrary to the church in the Middle Ages, we know it doesn't work because the figures add up, and we have increased so much CO2 emission, and because we have this budget, I mean, the more we continue to emit, it's quite simple. It's like on your bank account. The more you spend, the shorter your bank account will be. As far as you don't inject new money, at the end you have nothing. But the problem is we don't have the way to inject new money, new CO2 in the system to reduce the amount, because carbon capture is, for the time being, very limited. It has been measured that you made a mention of 500 homes. Yes, 500 homes, yes, for climate. And it has been measured, it's 11 minutes of CO2 emission of the planet. So, I mean, out of 365 days, 11 minutes, I mean, it's not really effective. So this is the main problem. That's why we have to reframe completely the conversation and say, what is important is to decrease emissions. To have carbon credit is nice, but unfortunately it doesn't work effectively. So we should separate the two, and on one side we say we invest in climate protection. Okay, fine. We help people around the world to decrease CO2 emission. We pay to keep forests alive, and so this is a climate protection. It means we make an extra effort to provide support to somehow avoid emissions. But we didn't solve the problem in that case. We still have to decrease. And so we should, in my view, separate these ideas that we can buy off CO2 because it just doesn't work, and say we make an investment in climate protection. And one company here in Switzerland, it's called My Climate, and used to provide this kind of certificate. Last year they switched this idea, and nowadays they don't sell any more certification. They sell protection, climate protection. So you invest in a project. So in my view, we should not be able to subtract these credits, because at the end of the day, what has been emitted will stay there, and the fact that you might avoid some kind of emission will not compensate really. It's like with your bank account. If you don't inject new money, I mean, the money is lost. So now in terms of technologies and so on, I think when you are in a crisis, the best way is to reduce. So if you have a fire, the best way is to extinguish the fire. So first to avoid adding new oil, to bring a lot of water. So technology somehow is a kind of water you add. But as far as you continue to inject oil in the fire, I mean, you can invent new kind of waters, but it will not change anything. So I think we should avoid this idea that technology will solve the problem. It will not solve the problem. It will just delay the solution, make it worse. I'm not saying we should not invest in technologies, but we should really realize that the recipe is not that difficult. Is we have to avoid to add fire, to add oil in the fire. And we know what's the problem. It's fossil fuels. And so, as Nathan very rightly mentioned, if we want to really to use the forces of the market, the carbon pricing by definition is the right solution. Because the more you will have to pay, the more you will have an incentive to switch and to change. If you take a very simple example, energy, because of the Ukraine invasion, started to go up quite high in the recent years. So for a long, long time, if you take here the example in Switzerland, the cost of energy was somehow pretty low. So you can leave the window open in winter, leave on the light because at the end it doesn't make such a big difference on the bill. But as soon as the price started to go much higher, suddenly there was a lot of ideas how we can reduce energy consumption. Why? Not because of climate change, but because it's too expensive. So these are the forces of the market. And it's pretty simple. When you go shopping, if something is just too expensive, you just don't buy it. And so it will be the same for carbon pricing. It means that if you buy something that will emit little, like a piece of bread, the difference will not be that much. But if you buy a sports car, I mean, this is different discourse. You need a lot of energy to produce this sport car. By the way, somehow it's completely useless. But if you are happy with it, fine with you. But you have somehow to pay for the damage you have done. So if you have a carbon pricing, and suddenly this car will be extremely expensive, goes the same for private planes and so on, even the ones that can afford it will start to think twice. Say, yes, my sport car is really a luxury item even for me. And here we have to realize that CO2 emission is not the same everywhere. 10% of the population is emitting 50% of CO2 emission, or even less, or even more. You have differences of people that emit 1 ton per year and people that emit 200 tons per year. The reality of the planet is it can absorb 1 ton per year. So the ones that emit almost nothing nowadays are the ones that somehow are sustainable. All the other ones are not sustainable. So how can you convince the one that emit 200 tons that for the time being pay nothing more? On the contrary, they have usually they're also quite good at tax evasion. So these ones that damage the more the planet, that make it unlivable for humanity, have just no cost. I mean, it's like if you have someone who is destroying, let's say, this window and the whole building, and you say, no, it's not a big deal because you are rich. But the poor one that is making a scratch in the entrance, you say, no, this is very bad. You have to pay. I mean, it's just not acceptable. So how can we force these ones? That's why we don't go for the recipe of COVID. We say, now it's over. You are not allowed to emit CO2 emission, full stop. Okay. This might be a recipe, but obviously it will be harsh to implement. So the only way, in my view, is carbon pricing. Because when these people will have to pay much, much, much more, first, they will realize, in fact, we are emitting. I had no clue. So to use my plane to go for half an hour trip, in fact, it's quite bad because I have to pay so much that maybe next time I will take the train. I mean, they will discover, and everyone on this planet will discover how much it emits. For the time being, you have no clue. You buy stuff, you have just no clue if it's emitting or not. You buy a piece of meat or you buy vegetables. I mean, according to the price, and if you are hungry or not, you will say, okay, meat is fine for tonight and vegetables is fine for tomorrow. But you have no way to measure it. And the differences are huge. If we make 1 kilometer by plane, you can make 88 kilometers by train. So it's a big difference. But if you have no way to measure it, no indication by the market that there is a difference, where is the incentive? It doesn't exist. So we should really, first of all, move from the idea that we can emit as much as we like. No, because there is a carbon budget. And second, to have a price for this emission. And in my view, the price should be even exponential because the damage is also exponential. The more we emit, the worse it will be. So the more you make a damage, the more you will have to pay. And by doing so, we can really change the world. And what is extremely important also to know, that the damage we have created has already a huge, huge cost. It has been calculated that for developing countries, if we want to make sure that first, we pay for the damage already created, and second, we make sure that they don't increase the damage, is between 200 and 300 billion per year. Where this money is coming from? I mean, industrialist countries are going to pay? I doubt.
Let me bring in a perspective. So we were talking about the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and they have a critical difference beyond all the details and implementation. That one failed and the other one hasn't. And what is the difference is that the Kyoto Protocol was legally binding. This is what you must do. This is the standard. You must get there. But it's just a stick. There's no positive value in actually achieving it. I mean, how many people know of the countries that fulfilled their Kyoto Protocol pledges? It kind of went down under the bridge. I like to compare it, like when you go to the IT department, the IT department is never applauded for when everything works. It's just, it either works and then everybody's quiet, or it doesn't work and everybody's frustrated. So to me, the Paris Agreement gives that opportunity to have a little bit more of these carrots, that you can say, okay, well, we're all fulfilling our promises, and countries are really proud to be able to announce these larger pledges. And that is the reason why it got everybody on board, because it was something that allowed countries to pride themselves in what they were doing in companies. And to me, carbon credits and carbon taxes could be two sides of the same coin, in that carbon credits allows countries and companies to say, well, we've done this, we've reduced our emissions, and we are actually making a positive impact. Now, this is assuming that carbon credits and all the problems that I was discussing actually are solved and this becomes a credible market. But I just see that if we only have the sticks, the condition that must be met with no positive bragging rights, to put it in uncharitable terms, we will have a similar outcome as the Kyoto Protocol, which doesn't really give that opportunity for indulgence.
Yeah. So again, as I said in my initial intervention, so we need the sticks and the carrots. I mean, that's what we know. And I agree with Jean-Pierre that part of it is how much time we have. And again, I'm bringing the story of COVID because initially here in Switzerland, the government was saying, okay, let's act respectfully, let's protect our elders, let's do this, let's do that, let's do education. They gave all these incentives for people to feel empowered by protecting their families and stuff like that. Then they realized that even in Switzerland, with all the law abidance and all this respectful society and obedient people, whatever else, the infection rates were as they were in Italy or anywhere else. And since the virus, and the same I agree with Jean-Pierre, the planet is not, we cannot negotiate with the planet on how long it would take to exhaust this budget. The same way we couldn't negotiate with the viruses. So, okay, now let's educate our people, let's give all these positive incentives so people, and you just hold there, stay on the side, and then you come back in and we'll deal with it. No, I mean, we have a crisis, and I agree with Jean-Pierre. I mean, so first, let's get fired. I mean, so it's like COVID. First, we stop. And that's what every government realized. First, we stop. And I remember, because I was talking a lot with us, again, I'm using COVID as an example because it's when mankind has to deal with nature, which we cannot discuss with nature. So we're really very good at discussing with, even like when wars and stuff like that, we have negotiations behind the scenes, this way, that way. But with nature, we have no discussion. There's no way we can discuss with nature. And so that's when we have to act. We cannot buy time. So I think that I agree there that you have to give the positive incentives, the carrots, but you have to apply something immediately to reduce the emissions. And the only way it works, and I think we're all in agreement here, is if the price of carbon is high, it goes into the price of goods, and we actually stop, and so I'm a little bit more pessimistic, and I agree. I mean, these things are, even pessimistic about carbon taxes. They will probably be implemented too late. And so my scenario is actually we'll see a COVID story where at some point, I think maybe in China it's really easy to do because they're large emitters and they have pretty good control. I think they would say, like, it could happen in 2 years because as the weather, as the climate is, they could say, okay, so in China, I think that's a country where they can implement this immediately. They could say, okay, so you stop driving cars, that's it. And they'll do it. And so, I mean, these things, because we don't have the time. But I think, again, at this point, we have to really raise the price of carbon to be comparable with the kind of risk we're facing. And I also agree with Matt, with Miklos. We have to get the incentives also for the technology. And again, I'm repeating the COVID thing. So first we stop. Then we develop the technology to allow us to move forward. So now we don't have to wear masks all the time, and we don't have to stay at home because we have the technology that allows us to live with the virus and not to suffer great cost. So the same thing here. I don't think, once we have the right technology, I'm not saying we want to encourage people to pollute more, but we can have some equilibrium. Some things, some pollution cannot be reduced to zero. Some things will still emit stuff. Even if we have the highest carbon tax, it will be really hard to stop emitting anything. So, but we can go into an environment where we have the technology that allows us to deal with whatever these emissions would be in the future without compromising nature. So we have to develop this technology. So the first thing I agree is like stop, and then think about the technology and encourage the technology, and that's where carbon credits are really important. Encourage the technology to allow us to live with a virus and continue our lives without taking drastic measures.
Thank you so much. I would like to have final question from my side, and then I will kick off the Q&A session. So my last question will be, I just realized the idea of degrowth discussed in the class, and I was wondering, is it possible either carbon tax or carbon pricing could lead to degrowth in countries where 10% of the people emitting 50% of the carbon emissions in regions like this?
I think the idea of degrowth somehow is wrong. We should much more have the idea of sufficiency. It means that the planet is what it is. And we are part of this planet. We are part of this ecosystem. We cannot be the only one to live in a different way than all the other species. So it means the amount of energy we are using is just beyond imagination. We are 0.01% of the biomass of this planet, okay? And we have already exhausted 1/3 of all resources of the planet. So imagine as a species doing the same, we would have never existed. Because, the history of the planet is quite long, 4.5 billion years. Life started around 600 million years. So we have more or less 4 billion years of history of life. And it evolved in a way that is completely self-sufficient. It means that it's use the energy that is needed to grow and to continue. We are the only one outside of this paradigm, taking all resources, we think they are just here for free, and spending like crazy people. So it means that if you take Switzerland, to continue to live as we live, we need 3 planets. So people will say, yeah, Switzerland is nice. I would like to live like the Swiss. But it's just impossible because we need these 3 planets. Where are they? So we have to realize it's not a matter of degrowth. It's to go back to the planetary boundaries. And it has been measured that there are 9 planetary boundaries. One is climate, biodiversity, waters, new products, and so on. And 6 of them have already been exceeded. So it means that we are going not only against the wall, not even to hell. We are just destroying humanity as we know. it's just beyond what is possible by this planet. So we should realize that the way we live, especially in hyper-consuming societies, has just no future because the resources are not available. 10% of the people of this planet are using the plane. What do you do with the other 90%? You tell them, no, I'm really sorry for you, no problem. Forget about it because it's just for me. You have to remain poor and imagine your future being poor forever because I'm using the plane, so sorry. It just doesn't work. Nowadays, just to give you a small example, we had here in Geneva 2 weeks of vacation for Easter. People went where? To the other side of the planet with the kids. I'll go to Thailand, I'll go to Peru, fantastic, doesn't cost anything. The cost of food is 7% of a salary nowadays. So you have still 93% to spend to enjoy life. So you take the plane, you emit 5 tons of CO2 in one trip. It's the CO2 that should be emitted over 5 years for an inhabitant of this planet. And you have done it in 1 week. That's it, fine. Where's the problem? No problem, fine. I have 2 weeks of vacation, let's enjoy it. It just doesn't work. Physically, it's not possible. So we have to realize this and to make it well known by every single human being on this planet that we have to reduce our way of living. It's not possible. And by the way, do we need 500 jackets, 200 pairs of shoes to sell them away and to buy them back because it's so cheap? No. So we have to really reframe completely the way the system is working because it's just not going to work anymore. So this is really fundamental. And by the way, the CO2 emission of the Swiss average is not 5 tons, it's 12. And here it's very important to make the difference. Countries, when they agreed in Paris, in Kyoto and so on, they made a wonderful trick. Say, we are responsible only for what we emit locally. It means the emission we really produce. So if I have an industry here in Switzerland, I emit so this I'm responsible for. For the rest, all what I import, it's not my problem, because I import from China, they are very big emitting countries, what can I do? But in fact, it's completely wrong, because at the end of the day, for the planet, it's not what you produce locally, but it's what you emit. So if you buy a lot of stuff and you import a lot of stuff, who is responsible? You, because you bought it, you consumed it, and you throw it away. And so the difference is huge. Switzerland is 12 tons of CO2, or even more. I mean, in fact, nobody knows really because they don't measure it so well. But let's assume it's 12 tons. 12 tons, it means that it's 12 times more than what the planet can absorb. So it means that Switzerland, as I mentioned, we have the budget, it's around less than 30 tons now per single inhabitant on this planet. It means that the Swiss people in 3 years have exhausted their budget. It's over. So we should tell them from nowadays, you don't even breathe because budget is exhausted. We emit 1 kilo of CO2 every single human being just by breathing. But this is absorbed by the planet. We don't count it. But all the rest is in addition. And so it's really important to realize that what is really important is the real emission at the end of the day. And so sufficiency and the idea is that we should go back to a life where it's in accordance with what the planet can afford, in my view, is the best way to change completely.
Thank you so much. I saw hands beforehand. Maybe you like to. Yes, go ahead.
I have 2 questions. One is regarding the regulation of voluntary carbon markets, because right now it's a bit decentralized and there are organizations like ICVCM which are providing the principles for carbon accounting and so on and so forth. But the Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement has a mechanism for providing like a global regulated market, which is voluntary carbon market still. So what are your thoughts on whether that kind of market would work effectively or not? One. Second thing is regarding the price of carbon credits in the voluntary market. Because as far as I know, I don't know about that carbon capture, but other carbon credits are priced around $14 per ton and so on, and even less than that. And that price varies from project to project. So agriculture projects are priced differently, renewable energy projects are priced differently, and so on and so forth. And they don't seem to be factoring into the social cost of carbon, which John mentioned, the cost of actual damage. And they had also put a picture of the Dubai airport, the thing which happened 2 days back. So the price, can there be some standardization around this price where we can factor in social cost of carbon, one? And the previous question, will a globally regulated voluntary carbon market work?
Should I take the first one?
Yes, please.
So we're talking about Paris Agreement, Article 6.4. It's this article that regulates how double counting should be regulated. So the example was exactly what we were talking about. If a ton of carbon is sequestered in one country and another country buys that, who should be able to account for that credit in their own budget? Because it's being sequestered in one place, but another country is buying it. And there are difficulties with both of them that have very big implications on how the market is going to develop based on that. And at COP28 in Dubai just a few months ago, there was this great hope that we'd finally finish all the small print for this Article 6.4, and it didn't work. So Paris Agreement was supposed to be finished in Paris in 2015. And since then, we are still arguing about some of these small points. So at this point, we're not quite there yet.
The second question
Was regarding the price of these carbon credits, because they do not factor in the social cost of carbon.
Sure. That's why, I will repeat what we have said both together. We should put the price not on the credits, to put the price on carbon. As far as we continue to live in this fantasy land where we think we can somehow absorb the CO2 in a way that is not in line with reality, you can put any kind of price, but as far as it is according to the forces of the market, it will depend. I mean, you cannot force to have bonds at some price and suddenly say, no, we have to reduce. These are by definition the forces of the market. So we have seen, as Miklos presented, if you have a lot of requests, it goes up. If you have nobody looking for it, it goes down. This is precisely the mechanism of the market. On the contrary, carbon pricing, you can fix it, because it's like a tax. You say it's 1%, 5%, 10%, whatever. You say for 1 kilo of CO2, I don't know, it's 1 franc. I mean, you can decide, and you can apply it across the board. And there you can have a real price. For carbon credits, it's according to the forces of the market.
Can I have a small follow-up on that? Because I think the BCG and Shell had jointly published a report in 2022 around the voluntary carbon markets, and there is a graph over there which tells that in terms of volume of emissions, 98% is under compliance market, and about 2% is under the voluntary carbon market. So in that sense, and since he mentioned, it appears that he is in favor of compliance carbon pricing systems. So what is the hope for voluntary carbon markets? Is there a good future for them, or the entire world will ultimately come into compliance carbon pricing system?
So I see the real danger that the voluntary market goes the same way as the nuclear market went. Now, this is a very controversial issue. I'll be perfectly honest. I'm absolutely in favor of nuclear. Feel free to debate that at another stage. But the problem is that we had a few too many scandals, and thus the whole world started thinking that this is much more dangerous than it actually is. And I think that if we have too many scandals with carbon credits, which we've had a few in the last few years and months, we might go down the same avenue in which the problems are taken out of proportion and a potentially very good solution is no longer available. But as I reflected in my 25-minute talk, I don't know where it's going. It could explode and become very big, but there's also a real chance that it could lay dormant for quite a while. I will say though that probably 2026 and 2029 we'll see an increase, because in 2027 we're going to get CORSIA. This is regulation around airlines and the carbon emissions that they have. And then 2030, because there will be a whole bunch of countries and companies that are making 2030 commitments. And in 2029, we'll start realizing that they're not there yet and need to buy carbon credits, that we might have some significant increases. But where the long-term future goes, I think it's an absolute necessity to fight the climate change challenge. But whether it is one that we actually use is anyone's guess.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Just a small question, but you mentioned the companies commit to net negative instead of net zero. Is there anything more substantive behind it, or is it like 1 ton less than net zero? Or what the companies mean when they say they go net negative?
It just sounds good.
Which,
But yeah,
and
the idea is you
that's
buy
what I
more
assumed.
credits. Okay. You buy more offsets than you're producing.
all right.
Questions? Yes, please.
I have a question for Frank here. You said we have 5 years to make that happen. And I mean, we know it, or at least in Switzerland, most people know it's in the first report of the public loan, so I don't know, 35, 40 years. And I'm wondering, I mean, if I go to the supermarket, the meat is still cheaper than the soya product. If you fly, it's still cheaper than the train. So how should that happen in 5 years to adapt that? Like to have such a tax that will make everything emitting a lot of carbon much more expensive?
I mean, unfortunately, I'm not somehow the one who can decide to organize carbon pricing. This should be organized by governments. Governments should have, for once, some courage. As Nathan mentioned, they had this courage when we had COVID. Why? Because the pressure was immense. You had 100,000, millions of people dying. So even if you are a government, usually you react very slowly. You have to do something. You cannot just say, we'll discuss it, we'll have a special commission on it, and we'll find a solution. No, it was not possible. They had to react. So they even invented that, to put a mask might be a good solution. But as we don't have masks, we should not say it so loudly. Say, it's coming in the future, but if you can avoid to be close to each other, it would be a good recipe. So it was just a disaster. But because it was so harsh, they had to act, and at the end, they said, okay, you stay home, it's the only way to find something. So they had the courage to do it. The problem with CO2 emission, there is not such a harsh reality. Because you have the flooding in Dubai, in Zurich or in Bern or in Paris, wow, such a bad luck. But thanks God, it's not happening here.
It's the fifth time we have flooding in Dubai.
Yes, but still, I mean, it's not happening right here, right now, all over the world, contrary to COVID that was spread all over the world. So it means that somehow the incentive to implement carbon pricing is not that big, because first we have to agree somehow on the level of carbon pricing. What is feasible? But by definition, governments are quite happy to announce good news. And carbon pricing will not be such a good news, because you will tell everyone you have to pay. As we live in a fantasy land and we say, don't worry, we are in charge. We are carbon neutral, we are carbon negative, everything is fine. What is good for you to do is to consume. We should say the reality is no, what is good to do is to limit consumption, because you don't need 5 dresses. It's nice for growth, but at the end of the day you destroy the planet. So you destroy yourself. Which government is smart enough to say the truth? No one. Let's be realistic. No one. Why? Because they will never be elected. So it means that their political horizon will end pretty soon. But we have to face the reality, and it's precisely what happened to COVID. They couldn't think about political future because they had to give an answer within days, weeks. And here, we should realize it exactly the same, but much worse. Because COVID, we had 3-dose injection, it was done. Where is the 3-dose injection against climate change? I don't see it.
If I
So-
can add to that, I think just to strengthen the point, I mean, with the difference, I mean, there are many parallels, but I think as Jean-Pierre was saying, with carbon, I mean, there are two things. One is that the damage is not evenly distributed. I mean, even with COVID, it wasn't evenly distributed, but advanced economies suffered from it actually in some sense more than some of the lower income economies. But in terms of carbon, there is this heterogeneity in terms of the cost, of the immediate cost, at least, of the global warming. But also, unlike COVID, also the mitigation suffers from this externality, because Switzerland could say, I'm going to reduce to 0, but if everybody else is not doing it, it's not going to change anything. Whereas with COVID, say if we all stayed home in our country, we prevent infection in our country. So it's internalized, where this is external. And that's why I agree with Jean-Pierre, this is something we're working together of trying to, is you need it to be universally and global, because it can't be just in one country, it can't be and that's something we're jointly trying to promote in terms of this universal. It has to be universal in order to be, because if everybody just does their own calculation, it doesn't work because of this externality issue that whatever you're doing is not going to stop, especially if you're a small country, even Switzerland, where you say 12 tons, so we reduce to 1. But if nobody else does this, we're still going to see all our snow caps melt and the Lake of Geneva dry in 3 or 4 years. So that's kind of, so that's why we need global action on this, which is, I agree, politically much harder to coordinate. That's why I said before, I'm kind of counting on countries that, like China, that emit a lot, but also will suffer a lot. So for them, this externality issue is weaker. And that's why they have an incentive to act, and we see that China is already acting in terms of solar panels and the technology and everything, because this is a country where also they're sufficiently large in emissions that if China completely stops to emit, I think we buy a lot of time. And for them also the cost is huge, because they're exposed to huge costs, unlike say Norway. To global warming. The same applies to India, but India is harder to coordinate than China in terms of politics. But these are two large emitters that are also suffering a lot from global warming, and it's enough that they internalize to buy us a lot of time. And so this is kind of in a worse scenario. When we cannot coordinate a global carbon tax. I think that those countries, I think, in the end, for their own survival, they said the politicians, they need to live the next day, they will do this internally, unfortunately. Because I'm more skeptical about the 5 years than probably Jean-Pierre is. I don't think we have 5 years. We have much less to act. I mean, the scientists, every IPCC are updating upwards. And so again, now it's a little bit cold, but remember last week we had 30 degrees in Geneva in late March, early April. Last summer, I think there was, 2 months of an average of almost 28 to 30 here in Geneva. So, and they're predicting this summer is going to be even worse. So even Switzerland might impact this, because people, I mean, the snow caps, all the skiing results, all these things that are taken for granted here in Switzerland are also. So I think that even in Switzerland, people will start feeling it. Maybe not in the north of Norway or something, but anywhere else, yeah.
Thank you so much. We actually have limited time, so if you want to stay and then have further conversation with our panelists. This is very welcomed. But anyway, thank you so much for coming. This is a wonderful event, both because of you experts and you experts. So again, thank you so much.